And for more on the story, we speak to Dr. Januka Atanayaka. He's Research Fellow on Earthquake Seismology at the University of Melbourne. Now, Doctor, we just mentioned this is an unusual phenomenon. Is it really unusual?
So it really depends on who you talk to. People, if you talk to someone who's living very close to a plate boundary, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake is not very unusual. But if you talk to someone who's living in the plate interior, like in Australia, they might find it a bit unusual. In Australia, we get about a magnitude 6 or greater earthquake every 6 to 8 years. And those earthquakes mostly occur in the western half of the continent. But this earthquake occurred in the eastern half of the continent. And we think that just by looking at a record of about 200 years, we think that this is the largest earthquake to occur onshore in Australia.
All right,
in the eastern half, that should be.
If we look beyond Australia, of course, recent similar events in Japan, in Indonesia, in the Canary Islands, in the Philippines, the question of is volcanic activity becoming rather more frequent? Now, before we crossed you, I did a quick check online, and quite a few people have actually posed this question, and the answer I have already got it. It is not more frequent, is in fact rather less frequent than we would expect, given what we have noticed across the many thousands of years. Would you agree with that? Are we seeing more or less volcanic activity?
So one thing you have to understand is that some of these disasters, like earthquakes, occur in clusters in time. So there might, if you're not talking to scientists, people might say that there's more earthquakes occurring now than like 10 years ago. Maybe in their view that could be correct, but if you look at a longer time period, we don't see an increase in, for example, earthquakes and volcanic activity. It's just that these events are clustered in time.
Well, the other explanations are, first, there is more human interest in volcanoes. Two, of course, we have the technology. We can live stream events like that safely as well. There are drones that can monitor volcanic activity, which, say, 100 years ago, that would not have been possible. So we have the science for it, we've got the interest in it, so we are seeing more of it, also because human populations are moving into more natural areas, so we're closer up with volcanoes than we would have been, say, 200 years ago. So the impression is more volcanic activity, when in fact, as you mentioned, not so.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that. There are more people moving into areas, disaster-prone areas, and therefore they experience more disasters, right? That's natural. And also social media has transformed how we view disasters. For example, social media in Melbourne flared up after today's earthquake. It doesn't mean that there's a greater risk of earthquakes. Earthquakes have always been occurring at timescales of 10 to 20 years of this magnitude, but it's just that people are more sensitive given that the hyper era of media that we are living in.
Our final question here, Doctor. Possibly, and this is a study from 2017 where researchers looked at glacier coverage and possible volcanic activity. They said where areas in the world where glaciers and volcanoes interact, where glaciers retreat, you are more likely to see an increase in volcanic activity. Looking at climate change, which would lead to more glaciers retreating from their current sizes, do you think as we continue to battle climate change, and at this point fail to battle climate change, are we likely to see more volcanic activity?
Yeah, there's a theoretical argument to be made there, because if you take out the load that is pressing down the Earth's crust, that should have some impact on the stresses in the crust, right? So you could potentially theorize that there should be more volcanic activities. Plus, it could lead to more earthquakes, but there's no real evidence of that as yet, because potentially we are at the very early stages of drastic changes occurring in terms of the loads that the Earth's crust is experiencing with climate change. So there's no real statistically robust evidence to suggest that, but I can imagine that theoretical argument being made.
Thanks so much for clarifying all that for us, Dr. Januka Atanayaka from the University of Melbourne. Thanks so much for that.